By 1777, the American Revolution on the East Coast had settled into a brutal, grinding stalemate. But hundreds of miles to the west, isolated settlers were living through a nightmare they called the Bloody Sevens, a relentless wave of violence sweeping across the frontier. The architect of this violence was Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton, the British commander at Detroit. Hamilton employed a highly effective asymmetric tactic to control the region. He paid bounties to Native American war parties to systematically raid and wipe out the scattered Kentucky settlements. The American pioneers responded by building wooden stockades, hoping to simply survive the next attack. A 25-year-old militia leader named George Rogers Clark looked at this strategy and realized the math was entirely against them. Fighting a strictly defensive war across hundreds of miles of wilderness was a guaranteed way to lose it. The only solution was a direct offensive against the British supply lines. Clark traveled back to Virginia and successfully pitched an expedition to capture the western British forts. The government authorized him to raise 350 men. The reality of what he actually received was drastically different. He got 0 artillery, no official uniforms, no funding, and only 178 poorly equipped militiamen. Clark was knowingly marching into a logistical nightmare. He was attempting to conquer an entire theater of war, taking on the British Empire in the West with less than half the required force. The campaign started with a bloodless victory when Clark's men captured the French-speaking town of Kaskaskia. But Hamilton struck back almost immediately. He marched a 600-man force south and easily recaptured Fort Sackville, located at Vincennes. Then Hamilton made a calculated decision to pause his campaign. It was December, and the Wabash River basin had flooded the entire region, turning the terrain around Vincennes into miles of standing, freezing water. Hamilton assumed this flooded landscape provided an impenetrable natural defense against any American counterattack and sent his native allies home until spring. Looking at this map of the region, we can see the exact threat Clark was facing. A captured merchant arrived in Kaskaskia with vital intelligence. Hamilton was sitting behind that flooded Wabash River barrier, simply waiting for spring to gather his full force and wipe the Kentucky settlements off the map permanently. Clark faced a binary choice. He could retreat and watch Kentucky fall, or he could attempt to march his under-equipped men through a frozen, flooded wilderness that British military command had already categorized as geographically impossible to cross. The vacuum of winter created a paradox. Hamilton's absolute confidence that the weather would protect him became the exact vulnerability Clark needed to exploit. In February 1779, Clark and his men set out into the saturated plains of southern Illinois. Logistics broke down almost instantly. It rained daily. Within 2 weeks, their food ran out entirely. Men were wading through standing water for miles, physically deteriorating to the point where the stronger soldiers had to carry the weak. By February 21st, they reached the ultimate barrier separating them from Vincennes. Before them lay a 4-mile-wide flooded plain capped with surface ice. Starving and freezing on a tiny patch of muddy high ground, the men were at the absolute brink of mass desertion. Clark didn't offer a rousing speech about patriotism. He smeared black gunpowder across his face, let out a war cry, and plunged chest-deep into the ice water. He forced his men to follow him through sheer social compliance. No one wanted to be the man left behind on the bank. Clark's first mechanism of asymmetric victory was weaponized human endurance. He forced his militia to physically survive conditions the British literally believed were unsurvivable. They finally reached the outskirts of Vincennes, but Clark only had 170 exhausted, half-starved men. Launching a direct frontal assault against the wooden walls of Fort Sackville would have been suicidal. This tactical diagram illustrates Clark's solution. He ordered his men to unfurl dozens of colorful company flags and march in continuous looping patterns behind small hills on the edge of town, manipulating the sight lines to make a small column look like an endless reinforcement. The psychological effect was immediate. The French townspeople and the British garrison watching from the fort were entirely paralyzed, convinced a massive 600-man American army had just arrived to lay siege. Clark then exploited a fatal structural flaw in Fort Sackville itself. It was positioned right in the middle of Vincennes, surrounded by civilian houses and fences that provided perfect cover for an attacking force. Taking up positions behind these structures, Clark leveraged a severe technological mismatch. His Kentucky frontiersmen carried rifles, rather than standard smoothbore muskets. They were accurate enough to put a lead ball directly through the narrow wooden gun ports of the fort from 100 yards away. This created a state of precision suppression. The British had cannons, but they were rendered completely useless. Any British gunner attempting to open a port to fire out was instantly shot by a marksman before he could light a fuse. Under relentless, highly accurate fire and believing he was vastly outnumbered, Hamilton agreed to an unconditional surrender. Without losing a single man in the assault, Clark inverted a massive numerical disadvantage through psychological warfare and precision marksmanship. Looking at the 1783 Treaty of Paris, we see a frontier skirmish escalate into global geopolitics. During negotiations, American diplomats used Clark's physical occupation of the Illinois forts as leverage. You cannot claim territory you don't hold. Clark held it. This historical map shows the staggering result of that leverage, highlighted in red. Britain ceded the entire Northwest Territory to the United States, effectively doubling the physical size of the original 13 colonies. The existence of the modern American Midwest, covering states from Ohio to Illinois to Wisconsin, is directly tied to a small group of freezing men refusing to stop walking in 1779. Yet the immense wealth in land that Clark secured for the nation stands in dark contrast to his own financial collapse. To finance the Vincennes campaign, Clark took on massive personal debt, using his own money and borrowing from friends to keep his men fed and armed. After the war, the bureaucracy took over. The Virginia and federal governments acknowledged the debts, but simply passed them from committee to committee for decades, refusing to fully reimburse him, while creditors systematically stripped Clark of his property. He slipped into a tragic, grinding decline. He suffered a severe stroke, had his right leg amputated after falling into a fireplace, and spent his final years completely paralyzed, dying in poverty. Audacity and selfless action are the mechanics that build empires, but governments rarely possess the mechanism to calculate or repay the true cost borne by their heroes.